Well, it's a pleasure to have you folks here. Always great to have return teachers coming here, and certainly wonderful to have some new faces as well. I'm not a big scholar of religion. I don't deal with religion a whole lot, and so it's a nice thing to have someone like Maggie around and Jonathan Reed, who's also with our project, also in religious history. And I could bounce ideas off of them, just as Tim is saying, he bounces ideas off of me. Well, I can raise some issues, and Maggie and Jonathan have enlightened me on different things. But religion does pop up frequently in my studies, and as someone mentioned, I can't remember who it was, that maybe Sarah was in the beginning. You can't teach American history without talking about religion. I mean, it's intricately involved here, and so. At the time of the American Revolution, religion plays a critical role, and it has evolved a great deal from the introduction that Maggie gave you, and it continues to evolve. There are, on your list, the outline that I made up for you folks, the very first statement is there are two fundamental traditions in American religious history. I would expand that to three now. But the first two are the established churches, and that would be mainly the Congregational Church in New England and the Anglican Church primarily in the southern colonies. And that holds true, that evolves. Anglicanism becomes the established church in New York when the English take over there in the 1660s. And Anglicanism takes over in Maryland, as Maggie showed. So you have that, but as Maggie mentioned, sort of in passing, she used the word schism several times. And the established churches are riddled with schisms. And so even within that establishment that's there, you're going to have disagreement. Sometimes that disagreement becomes so great that you have a actual separation, and there are dissenters. And dissenters will come from the established church, but they'll also come from other sources, and one would be from the Enlightenment, from the philosophy of reason from the continent. And this is so important because not only in religion is the Enlightenment crucial, but also in politics. And what's so fascinating, I think, not just for us as historians, but for people who were living at the time, they studied the Enlightenment, they studied the philosophy and the rhetoric that was there. But that's all it was to a great extent in Europe. But in America, they were living the Enlightenment, and everyone understood that, primarily from a political point of view. Obviously, it's also true from a religious point of view, and that's happening in Europe as well, because that's a third phase of the creation of these dissenters. A lot of European immigration. Obviously, we're familiar with the settlement of New England and the middle colonies. These are foreigners coming over, and in fact, by 1680 or so, more immigrants are coming from the continent and from Scotland and Ireland than from England. So England is no longer the main provider of immigrants coming into America. And a lot of these immigrants coming in are bringing their religions with them. And it's not just the main religions, but it's also some of the lesser religions, Moravians and Mennonites, and even smaller sects that are coming in. So you have that great diversity that is created in America. But the second important traditional religious perspective would be the freedom of religion. So you have in all America freedom of religion, but it's two different ways of life. you have the Massachusetts way of life. Come in, live with us, and become good Congregationalists. And if you're not a good Congregationalist, you've got some problems. If you go too far, you're going to be kicked out, like Roger Williams or Ann Hutchinson and others, and maybe even executed if you go too far. Whipped at first, banned, and if you come back too often, as Maggie said, you'll be executed. Your fault, not the government's fault for doing this. But that's one tradition, which is, I don't want to say completely in concrete. There's a certain degree of toleration that is allowed, even in those colonies that have established churches. But then you have that other side, totally other side, that most Americans like to think of when they think of freedom of religion, and that's Rhode Island and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. These are places where basically you have the choice. You can do whatever you want to do. There's always a qualifier. As long as it doesn't hurt somebody else, and as long as it's not licentiousness. My colleague Rich and I were giving a seminar to judges. We gave probably 120 seminars to federal judges all around the country. Usually these were one-day seminars. And we were in the 2nd District of New York, and one of the judges brought along her son. She asked if her son could come along. And he was about 10 years old, 10, 11 years old. And he asked us the question, was it a complete religious freedom? Could they do whatever they wanted? And Rich and I sort of looked at each other at that point, and we were not exactly sure how to answer that. And the answer is no. There were limitations. You could not hurt others, and you could not be licentious. These were things that went beyond the borders. The third fundamental principle is anti-Catholicism. There's a lot of this religion, that religion, but there's nothing like anti-Catholicism. I mean, Catholicism is the arch enemy. And this goes back to English history, obviously, the Henry VIII and establishing the Church of England. But the 17th century, the reign of the Stuart kings, which is important for us in that 12 of the 13 mainland American colonies are established during the reign of the 4 Stuart kings. James I, Charles I, then the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the reign of terror, if you want to put that in, of Cromwell, the Lord Protector, and then when he dies, we get rid of the Commonwealth and the monarchy is reestablished. And then you have Charles II, who flirts with Catholicism, and then James II, who is in fact a Catholic, and then has a Protestant daughter, which is okay, but then he has a son of a Catholic wife, and that's not okay. And that contributes toward the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And all of that has, so during that 1688, Maggie gave the date for Pennsylvania, 1681. So you see the 12 of the 13 colonies are established. Georgia is the only one that's not established. That's 1732. So the 12 original colonies are established. James I, 1603. So 1607, Jamestown. 12 of the first colonies established under the Stuarts. And religion is so critical, much more so under the second wave of the Stuart kings. That is the first wave, James I and Charles I, basically is money and taxation. A little bit of religion, especially when Charles marries the Spanish Catholic princess. But it's Charles I and II and James II where religion becomes the predominant issue, not taxation. And that's what the fight is about. And Americans are watching this going on all the time. And so they're quite aware of this. And it's truly a remarkable thing that when the revolution comes along, the actual fighting, Americans signed these treaties with the French, their arch enemy. And the reason it's the arch enemy, not only the English enemy, and so that's understandable, but they're Catholic. And one of the reasons to go to war for independence is the Quebec Act, which Maggie mentioned, and it so favored the French Canadians, who are promised they can keep their language, they can keep their religion, Catholicism, and they could keep their civil law as opposed to the common law. And not only could they keep it, but they can come down to the Ohio River, the exact area that the Americans, particularly Virginians, let's say, wanted to keep for themselves. And the Americans are told by the imperial government, the new imperial policy, you can't go beyond the crest of the Appalachians. And then 1774, the Quebec Act comes along. That very territory that was reserved for the Indians to keep peace is now given to the French Canadians, those Catholics. And so it's truly an amazing thing that you have this transformation of the Catholics becoming our allies. And the King of France, Louis XVI, it's interesting the names. John Adams wants a name for the president, a fancy dancing name. There are names for each of the kings, and the French king's name is what? Anyone know the French king's name? It's always a king, because you can't have a queen, a separate queen in France or in Spain. It's prohibited by law. So the French king is known as His Christian Majesty. The Spanish king is His Catholic Majesty. The English king, His Britannic Majesty. Each ruler has a name. The emperor, this is the Austro-Hungarian emperor. His High Mightinesses, this is the Dutch. And so each one has a name, and that's why John Adams wants to have a name for the president, so that the president will be on a plane with those folks, those rulers, and won't be down low. But anyway, the King Louis is toasted as the savior, as the great ally of America. A total transformation from all of American colonial history, where the Catholics are the dangerous element. And obviously, under the Articles of Confederation, it takes 9 states to admit a new state into the Union, except for one. And that one is Canada. Canada can come in anytime it wants to come in as the 14th state. And so one of the issues is, why didn't Canada come in? It had many of the same objections. I mean, 95% of those Canadians are French. They don't like the English. That's true. But they hate the Americans even more than they hate the English. And the English, in fact, are giving in concessions, the Quebec Act. And so they figure it's better to stay with the English than to go with the Americans. And probably the Americans are going to lose anyway. So why go with the losing side? And so this transformation of Catholics being the enemy to being allies is a critical factor at this time. Maggie alluded to some of these things about fundamental changes. You have the traditional established churches which start to break apart, and there's schisms and disestablishment going on in the revolutionary period of time. There's the second point, great point about the fundamental changes of the Revolution is this great diversity, the Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists, and it's caused by the Enlightenment to a certain extent. It's caused by the Enlightenment ideas that are being put forth, being caused by foreign immigration, and being caused by a great shortage of ministers. And so the early churches, these dissenting churches, are often run by lay people. And this would include women as well as men. Maggie mentioned in Virginia the vestry. Well, that's the primary method for advancement to leadership. You get to become a vestryman, and then you get to become a justice of the peace, and then you get elected to the House of Burgesses. And the final step in this movement up into political leadership is the council. If you can reach that, that would be the epitome. And that's the ladder, the political ladder in which you go up. Washington veered away from that. He was a vestryman, but then instead of really going toward the justice of the peace side, he enters the military. And he uses that as his vehicle for advancement. He then does get elected to the House of Burgesses and then gets his prominence in that way. But these lay people are really running most of these dissenting churches. just because of the lack of ministers that are available to serve in these churches. Maggie referred to the establishment of colleges at this time. Most of the colleges that are established at this time are church-oriented colleges, and there's by the time of the Revolution, there's about 10 colleges in the United States. The Enlightenment ideas the deists are fascinating, and we'll talk about the deists a little bit during this hour, but we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow when Carl and I will look at, I think we've got about a 90-page handout for you folks, and it lists the individuals and what they believe in. Deism is an important factor. Carl believes you got to be a full-fledged deist to be a deist. You can't be a partial deist. There probably aren't too many full-fledged deists at this time. You are non-deist, and then you become a deist. And whether you eventually get to be a full-blooded deist, I don't know. Maybe Paine is a full-blooded deist. Jefferson, maybe. We don't know about Franklin. We don't know whether he's an atheist. I don't know that he knows himself what he is. He talks about the Trinity, and he says, I've always questioned that. I don't know. And I still don't know, but this is in 1790, he says this. He dies in 1790, and he says, it's not a big deal to me, because I'm going to find out pretty soon whether there's a Trinity or not. George Washington? Well, a lot of people would certainly argue he's not a true deist, because he believes that God is involved in things, whereas deist doesn't believe that. And he has certain prayers. He does pray. People comment on him praying. And so I've seen him described as a deist slash, some other Greek philosophy. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he's not a pure deist. And so this is one of the problems, that when you're referring to deism and you start linking a lot of these people under this rhetoric, it's very easy to show that they're not pure deists. As Carl, as I said, will subscribe to that point of view. And so the ideas of deists are important at this time period. And you see that in a lot of their writings that become fundamental in the documents that we have. So that third point here is the rise of liberalism, which is fostered by the ideas of the Enlightenment. And Maggie, I was really quite interested when she listed the three people, Locke, Newton, and Bacon. What were they for? What were these? The Holy Trinity, which is wonderful, because Jefferson, when he's Secretary of State, he's running the government when Washington is not there. And so they have a cabinet meeting. The vice president is a legislator. He's not an executive at this time, really. So Jefferson's in charge as Secretary of State. So they're meeting in his house, and he's got all these portraits around the room. And he says, portraits are very expensive, and he brought these from Europe. But if you don't get the originals, which are expensive, you get knockoffs. You get copies. They're pretty cheap, and that's what I have. They're not as good, but they're cheap. And then, Hamilton is there. He says, who are these people? And he identifies who they are. And over his door, he's got a clover leaf frame, 3 portraits, Locke, Newton, and Bacon, the 3 greatest men who ever lived. And Jefferson tells us this account, so whether you want to believe it or not, the anti-Jefferson folks don't believe it. The pro-Hamilton folks don't believe it. But he asked Hamilton, who do you think is the greatest man who ever lived? And Jefferson says, Hamilton, without a hesitation, said Julius Caesar. So you couple that with Jefferson's fear that Hamilton favored monarchy, you see why Jefferson was afraid of Hamilton. But even this deist believes that these 3 great men, these were men who believed in science. Science at that time, for the scientifically minded, for the intellectuals at the time, I would say, had the same kind of power and influence that DNA has today. That is, if you are in a court and you get DNA evidence, that's conclusive. You know that this is a rapist. You know this is not a rapist if the DNA is there. Now, Thomas Jefferson has become the father of Sally Hemings' children because it was questionable, but once the DNA was tested, the problem is the historians who interpret the DNA have misinterpreted it. And the scholars, the scientists have said, you've misinterpreted. And so there are different interpretations from that. But the historical community, which is led by the liberal community, they all know that Jefferson is the father of Sally's children because of the DNA evidence. Even though the DNA evidence only proves one thing, and that one thing is Jefferson could not have been the father of Sally's first child. Therefore, the historical community says, are you trying to say Sally was promiscuous? Well, nobody's trying to say that, but the DNA evidence can prove that that first child was not a child of Thomas Jefferson. But the point is that DNA is so important to us today, just as science was for those folks. It's why Franklin becomes so important, because he is Dr. Franklin. He has understood the science of electricity, and he's written on it. And I don't know if any of you have read this, but his 1751 pamphlet on lightning, electricity, you should read it. It is wonderful. Have your kids read it. Kids could understand it. It is written so simplistically and with words that have come down to us, current, etc., electrical terminology that he's creating. It is a wonderful, short little pamphlet, only, 20 pages or so, and it explains about lightning and electricity. And this is what gains Franklin his real international recognition. And so you can see how important science was. And they're creating the Royal Academy in England, and they create the American Philosophical Society in America to foster scientific discoveries. And that's this Enlightenment idea, which is transferred then over to religion, just as it is in the scientific community. Maggie mentioned this, is the extermination of the African religions. And I don't like the idea of using the Holocaust terminology that John Butler does. I think that's a loaded word, and I think that it's a twofold thing, this extermination of the African religion, because I don't believe it actually ever occurred totally. Just as you can say that the Holocaust didn't get rid of all the Jews in the world. There are many Jews that survived the Holocaust. But so it was that Africans, it belittles the Africans that they didn't keep their religion. They kept a lot of their religion. They knew what their masters wanted them to do, and they took on Christianity, at least the outward appearance, but they kept a lot of their religion. Maggie?
May I just add, though, a lot of the African religions that he's specifically talking about are the more ritualistic, and his reasoning for using spiritual holocaust is he's saying you're taking from people the ability to deal with exactly what you're inflicting upon them, because you were inflicting trauma, you were inflicting death, and you were taking away the way that they deal with that ritualistically. And so that's why he gets that really in-depth spiritual holocaust terminology. So it's not the complete eradication, it's more specifically ritualistic and dealing with trauma. So there's a little bit of nuance there.
Well, as I say, a lot of the Africans kept much of their religion. And the masters were not terribly happy about that, and they understood that that was still there, even though superficially they might be Christian. But that had an impact also. What did the conversion to Christianity mean for this slave, and what did it mean for the master, and what did it mean for the white race also? The fact that now is one thing for the master to keep these brutes, these atheists, these pagans as slaves. But what what justifies you keeping a Christian as a slave? And so there is that transformation that takes place. And then where do they go to church? There's no African church, there's no slave church at that time. So they go to church with you and your families. And so there's that interaction that's there. And furthermore, it then gives them a story. It gives a rationalist story. And Madison is one who puts this in writing. Madison usually doesn't put things in writing, and so he's not condemned like Jefferson is condemned when he talks about perhaps the inferiority of the black race. And Jefferson is roundly attacked for that. I don't know that he comes up with that himself. He's reading the science of the time, and so he's part of that community. I mean, the whole Western European society, Europe and America, profoundly racist at this time. And so to distinguish one person as being the guilty person, like so many people point to Jefferson, the whole society, for the most part, is racist. Even the abolitionists, many of them, are racists. Abigail Adams is against slavery, but she's a racist. Benjamin Rush is opposed to slavery, but is a racist. And so there is that's there. But the story is this. This is divine providence. God has allowed slavery to exist for one primary purpose. That is so that we can take these pagans out of Africa, bring them to America, and make life a little bit more pleasant for them, make them a little bit happier, but more importantly, give them the true religion. And then once they get that true religion, what are we going to do? We're going to take away land from another race of people, and we're going to sell that land to get money to free that people in bondage, pay off the slave owners, so that the slaves then are now free, and we will have money to send them back to Africa, where they can proselytize the continent. This is the way that God has meant for Africa to become a Christian continent. And it's a roundabout way. It's going to take a couple centuries for that to happen. But Madison is not the only one who says this. Others are saying this. But Madison has it spelled out in one document. It's all there. I mean, it's an amazing thing. Ricky, you got a question?
Yeah, when I teach like the transatlantic slave trade, and I teach world history, so I don't go as in depth with the American perspective, but do you think that like the people like Jefferson and so forth, like, ever had to justify to anybody their reasoning for like this Christianization of slaves because it was so like Christian dominant in the colonies, or was there anybody that they did have to answer to, and like besides the slaves, about why they're doing this?
No, I think this comes about. There is a real deep understanding that slavery is an evil. Everyone pretty much buys into that. The positive good of slavery doesn't come about till a little bit later. There are individual isolated cases of someone who might say that, but this is a system foisted upon us by our ancestors and encouraged by the British government, encouraging the importation of slaves. And it's not us. We would like to get rid of slavery if we could, but we can't do it. It's not fair to the slaves. It's not fair to our society, but we got to figure out a way to do this. And obviously you get various religious groups pushing the idea of emancipation, Quakers being in the forefront of this, but the Methodists in Virginia really staunch advocates for emancipation. And in fact, by the end of the 18th century, there are well over 40,000 freedmen in Virginia and Maryland. So there is a movement for that. But once that happens, what are you going to do with these people? Are they going to fit in well with us? And the general perception is no, they won't. Partly because we think they're inferior, and partly because they hate us for what we've done to them, and rightly so. So we got to find a place for them to go. And West, well, there is this concept of manifest destiny. The term is not there, but there is the sense we're going to go there. And so if we put the freedmen out west, we'll eventually circle around them, and then we'll have this conflict that's there. Obviously, this is accentuated after the rebellion in Santo Domingo. So Africa is the best place to go. And that then just fits in very nicely with this proselytizing of the continent. And so it's I don't know that I would say that it was a widely held belief, but there are several people that have that concept. And it's just a rationalization on their part. How do we explain what we've been doing? How do we? And it's interesting that Madison has that, because when he's a youngster, and he's a youngster until he's 50. Now, what do I mean by that? His father dies in 1801, and Madison is 50 years old. So he's not running the plantation. But when he was really young, like 25, he said, I don't want to be a lawyer. I love the law. I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to be a merchant. I don't want to live by the sweat of another race. I don't want to be a planter. It's interesting for this group. What did he want to be? He wanted to be a history professor, a professor of geography and political science. That was what he wanted to do with his life. But obviously the revolution changed all of that for him. But he goes from, and Jefferson has the same sort of self-transformation, realizing that slavery is bad, we got to get rid of it, to the point where practicality comes into it. How do we actually do it? And if we do it, if we achieve emancipation, what's the consequence for the country, and how do we handle that consequence? So it's a really difficult issue, and the Colonization Society, the American Colonization Society, is the final outgrow of this, really, to try to raise money to transport the slaves to Africa and Liberia. Yes?
How did others rationalize it? Because it just seems so counterintuitive to Christianize the slaves and thereby kind of giving them the keys to their own freedom, because you like paint yourself into a corner.
Well, one thing is wonderful is the African point of view. And by the nirvana, the halcyon days for the slaves, going to be in the hereafter. And maybe if God is just, what will happen there is there will be a reversal, that the slaves will be the masters in the hereafter, and the white folks will be subordinate. There are many people who believe that there is a structured society in the hereafter. Abigail Adams is strongly in favor of that. And I talked about that once down in Texas to a large group of teachers, and one teacher came up to me afterwards and said, we believe that. I'm a Mormon. We believe there's a structured society in heaven. And so the better off you are here, the more intellectual, the more virtuous you are here, you'll start out better. You'll have more of the accoutrements in heaven to advance yourself in heaven. So be good here on earth, which give you a jump start in heaven. And so the African slaves here are using that sort of philosophy. Okay, let's tolerate it here. Let's not revolt. It's not so easy to revolt, but there will be a better time in the future. And so, but other folks are just saying that it's for the good of the slaves. Washington has a wonderful memo that he writes for his files, and he says, I can't do very much with the adults, but I'm trying to train the children so that they'll have a job, and so that when I die and the slaves will be freed, we'll free the slaves, that they'll be able to sustain themselves. I hope my maker understands. So that's what Washington says. But there are a lot of people that Jefferson doesn't have the financial wherewithal to free these people. So it's an economic issue as well. It's not just a matter of a race and slavery being good or bad. There's also another side that's a religious side. John Jay is an abolitionist. He's the founding president of the New York Abolition Society. He is appointed our minister designate to Spain, and he goes over there. Well, before he gets over there, however, they hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic, trying to avoid the British Navy. And I don't know if this is true, but I think that icebergs can sink ships. And they hit an iceberg. They got out of there in the middle of the night, no engine, wooden ship, and no lights. But they did get out of that iceberg field. And then they get hit by a storm, and they're demasted. And so the captain says, Mr. J, you're in charge. What do we do? Do we go back to America? Do we go to the French West Indies? Or do we go on to Europe? under the threat of the British Navy. And so he says, let's get refitted in the French West Indies. So they go to Martinique, and he's there with his wife. His wife goes with him, which is unusual. But there, he buys a slave. How can this happen, this abolitionist? How can he buy a slave? Anyone got any ideas?
All politics is local.
This is a teenager. He's about 13, 14 years old. And Jay realizes this boy, James is his name, is dead in 2 years. That's how long slaves live in the plantations in the South, in the West Indies. And so to save this boy from slavery and death, he buys him and makes him, in essence, an indentured servant. He pays him. And when James becomes an adult, he says, could I have my freedom? It would have been a wonderful thing had Jay said, yes, you're free. But he says, yes, you're free if you pay me what I paid for you. And he had been paying him some money as an indentured servant, and he does buy his freedom. So this is, I don't want to be somewhat facetious here, but it's not a black and white issue. Slavery is a tough issue. And here, if you point to John Jay as an abolitionist that owned a slave, but why did he own the slave?
To complicate things, didn't states purposely pass laws that restricted how and what conditions you could free a slave? Because
Absolutely.
the fear was that if a slave reached a certain age, they lose their productivity. So that would be the time when a master would say, okay, you're free, leave the plantation.
Absolutely.
And then what happens is you have this elderly slave who then can't take care of themselves.
Absolutely. They don't want slaves, freedmen, to be wards of the state. And so often when you freed somebody, you had to put up a bond that would guarantee there'd be enough money to provide for this person if the person couldn't provide for themselves. And sometimes in Virginia, you had to leave the state within a year. They changed that in 1782, but then they reestablished it after those Methodists tried to get emancipation.
Couldn't you stay if you could prove that you had obtained a certain wealth?
But you had to go before the legislature and get individual approval for that. So it's not so easy.
So if you're a humanitarian in a world of slavery, you wouldn't free your slaves.
That's a good justification. You'll be as kind as you can be. I know I got viciously attacked one time by a teacher down in Wake Forest. It was at the Cradle. It's an acronym for the Center for Research and Study and Development of Law-Related Education. And I indicated that there were a variety of slave owners. Some were more humane than others. You could not be humane if you were a slave owner. Now, I just think that's not true. Some slave owners were more humane than others. Some were vicious. Others, like Jefferson, I would say, was a businessman.
Is part of that because of the topography? I mean, the work conditions of a slave in Virginia are going to be vastly different than the work conditions of a slave in Georgia or soon to be Mississippi.
Well, there are differences in the gang system and the individual system, to be sure. But over and above that, I mean, human beings are more humane and more vicious. Some of them are. And so if you have this kind of power over somebody, it will be exercised in different ways. And so it's not just geography. Although I must say, Forrest McDonald wrote a book once, Novus Ordo Seclorum, on the Revolution, on the Constitution. He almost won the Pulitzer Prize for it. I'm the only one who criticized it in a book review. But I criticized particularly, I think it was page 52, in which he says American slavery was not so bad. He quoted one Englishman who was in Virginia and said, slaves have a pretty good life here. One person. That proves that slavery is not so bad. And then down in the Deep South, however, when the individual task system, the Virginia Chesapeake slave worked maybe 8 to 10 hours a day for the master. The rest of the time was free time for the slaves. They could do whatever they wanted.
When I was at Monticello, they had said that one of the biggest deterrents for slave misbehavior was, we'll sell you to the Deep South.
Yeah. Well, down in the Deep South, you had the individual system where they would work, and there, McDonald says they had an idyllic life. They only worked 3 hours a day, three and a half hours a day. And sometimes what they would do, these slaves, because they were smart, they would work 3 shifts together. and then they would take 2 days off as vacation and visit friends, family, and lovers on other plantations. And so in my review, the only time I've been nasty in my reviews, I said I was shocked that more white folks didn't have to become slaves. Such an idyllic life that they had at that time. The reason why they worked 3.5 hours a day was because it was so dangerous and so taxing. These slave owners were not stupid to risk their capital that they might die. And so they couldn't work them any harder because it was in the swamp and rice plantation, indigo.
Well, a lot of slave owners were in the north taking a vacation during that time of year too.
That's right. That's right. Well, I got to get on here beyond the slavery question here. But slavery is an important factor, and will become an important factor in my second presentation on the ratification of the Constitution. And then finally, I would say this fifth point: there's even though there's a general disestablishment that's taking place. First of all, several of the colonies did not have an established church, but several of the established churches were disestablished in various mechanisms during the Revolutionary period. But there is sort of a quasi-establishment of religion, and particularly the Christian religion. And this is shown through various legislation. I list here abortion, blasphemy, homosexuality, keeping the Sabbath holy, sumptuary laws, dueling, witchcraft. I mentioned the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. I don't know if any of you teach the Massachusetts Body of Liberty. You should. It's a fantastic document, 1641. New Englanders, remember I said these colonies are established during the Stuart reign, and you have the Commonwealth men, the writers. There are 20, Joyce Malcolm has published a 2-volume collection of pamphlets in 17th century England. She says there's 22,000 pamphlets. The genius of Jefferson, he takes those 22,000 pamphlets and another 1,000 American pamphlets, and he condenses them into 5 sentences, 202 words, the American philosophy of the government. That was Jefferson's genius. Took Locke 2 treatises to come up with his idea of the philosophy of government, but not Jefferson. But the Massachusetts Body of Liberty, by these members of their assembly, they fear government. They know that government can be oppressive, and so they want their liberties mentioned. There are 200 such documents in American colonial history where rights are protected in a peremptory fashion, not like in England where rights are protected once the monarch does something wrong. Magna Carta, Petition of Right, Bill of Rights. These are things when the monarch does something wrong, and the barons or others, the commons, say, don't do it again if you want our support. But in America, they do it in a peremptory fashion. They list these and say, don't violate these in the future. You haven't violated them in the past, but don't violate them in the future, because they don't have trained common law lawyers to draw upon the common law. So the Massachusetts Body of Liberties is probably the single most important one of these documents. And it lists all the rights that are in the English Bill of Rights, 50 years before the English Bill of Rights. All the rights, almost all the rights that are in the U.S. Bill of Rights, 150 years before the U.S. Bill of Rights. And it's got rights for women, rights for children, rights for aliens, rights for slaves, and even rights for animals. You cannot work your horse too hard. You cannot drive your cows, your cattle too much in a single day. There will be penalties for that. So it's a wonderful document. But it has a last page. And you go to that last page, and there are the capital punishments. Many of them scriptural from the Bible and these kinds of things that I mentioned here. And so probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a movement among historians to sign a petition saying abortion was common in colonial revolutionary America. And to a certain extent, that's true. But there are laws on the books, and this is a society that basically says you can do certain things like have an abortion, you can be homosexual, you can have relations with animals, bestiality, as long as you're not caught. If you're caught in the act, you're going to pay, you're going to be executed. But they don't go out of their way to try to catch people here. They understand there are homosexuals in that society. And as long as you're not caught in the act, no one's going to disturb you, pretty much.
So a forerunner of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
That's right. That's right. Yes. For the society as a whole. But if you tell or someone tells on you, you're in deep trouble. You're going to be executed here, and it won't be pleasant. And so I added something here that's not on your list. Yeah, Sarah?
Who created this body of liberties?
Oh, the legislature does, the lower house.
The colonial legislature
Massachusetts,
of
yes.
Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Doesn't last very long because they evolve into, only 8 years later, they have a body of laws, and that sort of takes over. And some of the protections are in those laws. But this Massachusetts Body of Liberties, 1641, is a very important document. And after all, one of the things that these colonies want to do is to attract immigrants. That's their salvation from all kinds of things, to preserve the colony itself, to increase land values, to provide labor, to provide a market for goods. All these things are contingent upon foreigners coming in. And you have to compete with other colonies. So this is a magnet you throw out there, hoping that it will bring folks coming into your community and residing with you. And you hope it's the best folks that'll come in, obviously not criminals and that type of thing.
So was homosexuality on that last page of the document under capital punishments?
I don't know if it was on that.
I'm looking at it
I
right
think
here.
it was.
Yeah, if any man lieth with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both shall have committed abomination, they both shall surely be put to death.
So there you go.
And it even says if somebody lies with a creature, they're put to death, and the beast will be slain and buried and not eaten.
For bestiality.
Yeah.
Which is Old Testament law.
Right. So you have that. It's sort of a Christian establishment that's being there. And the thing of it is, there's not much opposition because basically this is a Christian society. Not that people are Christian in the sense that, well, we want to say, as Maggie said, so many people didn't go to church. But they're not Muslims and they're not Jews. A very, very small portion of, virtually nobody is a Muslim at the time in America. And there are Jews that are being established different places. Maggie mentioned the Newport Synagogue, Touro Synagogue, established in 1783. But Philadelphia, New York, Charleston have Jewish communities. And they're tolerated under the surface. They can meet, but they're tolerated because they can do things that a Christian can't do. I'm talking about money lending and things of that nature. That there are prohibitions against Christians charging interest. You can see this in Magna Carta. Well, the Jews can do that, and so they serve a valuable purpose. Yes.
So in the cultural application of this document, obviously there's this dichotomy between the public persona of who you are and the private who you are. So if somebody is a homosexual, is the culture where you run off and tell somebody quickly that this person over here is a homosexual, or is the culture in Massachusetts at this time that it's kind of their business and keep it on the down low?
I mean, do you like this person or not?
Is there a record of a lot of
No. I mean, this is true also in voting. There are voting laws, and a lot of people violate the voting laws. And it's okay, as long as it's not a crucial election. If it's a crucial election, it's very close, then you see where voting laws are being violated. And you see that maybe this person doesn't have meet the property requirements. But as long as it's not an important election where it's so close, no one's going to be up in arms over this. But that's the way it is. A lot of these situations become critical, and thus, let's point fingers. Who's the problem person here? And what station in society is this person? Is this the son of a very wealthy townsman or not. There's a vagrant there. So there's a lot of ifs here. But for the most part, I mean, how can you prove something that doesn't happen? But I think for the most part, they're allowed to function and not challenged in this regard. So there's not a lot of executions for this. Although, throughout, for a 200-year period of time, one of the ways that ministers exercise their function, both internally and for their congregation, was they wanted to control their congregation. They minister heavily to the guilty parties who are going to die, who are going to be executed. And we have this genre of literature that develops. It is explained in Daniel Williams's Pillars of Salt. It's a wonderful book. It's a compilation of these accounts. So what the minister would do at first is preach to his congregation. If you don't behave, you're going to end up like Joe Smith, who just was executed. And it all starts with keeping the Sabbath holy. And then the next is honor your parents, and so forth and so on. These are the things you must do to make sure you don't become a criminal and die. And I'm also concerned, if I'm a minister, of saving this person's soul. And so they should repent, and God will welcome them into heaven. Mankind will not change their verdict, and you're going to die. There's no forgiveness from mankind. And so that's their duty. Well, eventually, it doesn't take long, maybe 20, 30 years, before they realize, hey, there's some money involved here, because everybody wants to come and see the execution. They're coming into the county seat, and they want to watch this. And so they start printing broadsides with these accounts, and they're very salacious sometimes, because they're written down from what the perpetrator has said. Well, eventually, and so they're selling these for like a penny a piece, and the printers are making money off of this. And the ministers then attach to that their sermon for the execution. And they get notoriety, and that's important for them. Well, eventually, they start hiring ghostwriters. And so these become professionally written, not the transcripts of the criminals, the ignorant. And then they hire also artists, and they do woodcuts for this. And every one of the examples that Dan Williams has a woodcut in it, and you can see it. And it all starts out with, it's women that caused all the problem. That's what the men say. It all started with the women. They led me down the wrong road. When women are the ones that are being executed, it's the men who've done it. They're the ones who are responsible. I was okay until that man came along and led me the wrong way. And so it's always trying to find the excuse as to why they fell. But eventually they'll come around to their innocence in the eyes of God, but they'll be executed. So that genre is there for 200 years, and it's a way for ministers to control their congregations as well. Put that fear in them that if you don't behave, this is what's going to happen. Now I have 10 minutes or 5 minutes to talk about, right? 5 minutes to talk about 80% of my stuff.
It'll be a new day in heaven.
Now, God's involvement here is sort of interesting. The Bible is the guide, and Maggie alluded to that. It can be used in different ways. It can be used as revelation. It can be used in reason. It can be used as history and experience. And so it's an important factor that's there. And you see the Federalist, number 37, James Madison, has this wonderful statement. I love that number. It's a number that doesn't get a whole lot of play compared to other Federalist papers. But he says in there, he's got one passage, I think it's only one paragraph, in which he talks about the importance of language and how the key word, he doesn't use the word, but the key word is perspicuity. You know that word, perspicuity? It is the ability to transfer my thoughts and ideas to you so that you know what I'm thinking. Not an easy thing to do in real life, particularly if you're talking about complicated stuff. And so that's what Madison is talking about, the difficulty of perspicuity. And he says in that, we got to struggle with that. And he's trying to explain the Constitution in this difficult concept of language. And he says, even when God has deigned to allow his message to be written in a language that we can understand, we don't really understand it. We disagree on the interpretation. And therefore, the Bible, although it's there, and it's a written word of God, and many would believe it is divinely inspired, both Old and New Testament, what does it mean? It can be differently interpreted. So that's a problem that's there. Now, and others will believe that God is intimately involved in day-to-day life. The death of a sparrow, the falling of a leaf, God knows all this is happening. And so predestination obviously is important in that. That will be an important factor. Another would be God is superficially involved and will work through human beings. And I have a quote, I don't know if I put it in all of yours, but it's in the packet you'll get tomorrow. I printed half of your copies, and then I thought, well, maybe I'll add John Jay. So half of you have John Jay, I think. Half of you don't have John Jay. But all of you will get John Jay tomorrow. This is what John Jay says. He says, providence seldom interposes in human affairs, but through the agency of human means. And so God uses people. And so you've got to act. You've got to take the initiative. God is not going to do it for all of us. We need God's help and direction, but we've got to be involved ourselves. And then you have the deist point of view, which would say God sets it all up and then leaves it to us. He sets all the rules, and everything after that is nature taking its course through the laws that God has created and through our own actions. So that becomes very important. I should mention the Anglican bishopric, and there's a real danger. This is on the eve of the revolution. There's a fear because so many of these churches that are being established, even the established churches, the individual town churches, there's a great deal of decentralization and locality. And so the fear of having an Anglican bishopric, many people like that because it makes life easier to ordain ministers, which is a tough thing to have ministers in America. They have to go to England to get ordained and then come back. Have an Anglican bishop here. The problem is they're going to have that kind of ecclesiastical control over us the way Parliament is trying to exercise, and the ministers are trying to exercise political and economic control over us. This is a dangerous mechanism here. And so people are worried about this Anglican bishopric that's coming along. And then patriots and loyalists. There's this spectrum. I always throw that in for Tim. He loves spectrums. But there are enthusiasts that support the revolution, that they believe that this is a God-oriented thing. And I'm going to end my later session on the concept of order and how order is so important. And so I'll develop that a little bit more, that those who favor the revolution, this is a very disruptive thing that they're doing, but they're doing it for a purpose, to reestablish the order that the British ministry has abolished. The 150 years of constitutional history that Americans had being endangered by the new imperial policy. And so the Americans, in declaring their independence, are not being the disorganizers. They're trying to reestablish order. Whereas the other side, the loyalists, and particularly the established churches, are more traditionally loyalists than the dissenters are more traditionally patriots in our nomenclature. But there is the sense that among the loyalists that the patriots are causing disorder, and for their own selfish reasons. They're not part of this British Empire community. Then there's another group of patriots that understand there's a certain degree of hypocrisy among the patriots, and so they're a little aware of that. Loyalists also believe that Christianity is on the side of the king and the royal government, and then there's the pacifists. and they don't want to fight. And sometimes they're tolerated, sometimes they're not. If you're with us, wonderful. If you're not with us, that means you're with the enemy. And so Quakers are often penalized. I was born in South Jersey. I left there when I was 11 months old. And so I don't have much knowledge there, but I go back every summer. And I visited Hancock House in South Jersey, where Quakers were right on the Kansas Creek. And they took the boats away so the British couldn't cross. Well, the British crossed, and they chased the Quakers up to the attic, and they killed them all up in the attic because they were not with us. So there must be patriots. And the blood of the patriots were up there, the Quakers, up in that attic. So, but the patriots didn't treat the pacifists very well either. And so when Philadelphia is about ready to be invaded and conquered by the British in 1778, the Quaker leaders, the wealthy merchants, are arrested and moved out of Philadelphia and sent to the Shenandoah Valley. First, there's no prisons; they can't put them in prison. But eventually, they're under house arrest there, and they're there for over a year. Their wives petitioned Congress, the Continental Congress, for their release. That won't happen. They send stagecoach wagons down to supply them with goods, and eventually, when the British evacuate Philadelphia, these Quakers are allowed back. So the Japanese incarceration during World War II is not the first time that a group has been arrested and incarcerated because they were felt to be a dangerous element. Why don't we stop there, and I can continue the rest of this in my other presentation. Okay, so you get your break here.
Any quick questions?
Yes, quick questions?
Was John Dickinson ever at risk of being, because he was a Quaker, correct?
There are a lot of Quakers that are not pacifists.
Gotcha. Okay.
And Dickinson enlisted in the Army. Thomas Mifflin is known as the Quaker general. So when Washington gets to Pennsylvania, he goes from 19,000 troops in New York down to 2,500 troops. And a lot of these people were either killed or they left, captured, or their time was up. And so Washington writes a letter to a nephew and says, the game is just about up. Well, he gets the idea, let's attack Trenton. And one reason he can attack Trenton is because the British, although Washington is diminished from 19,000 to 2,500, the British have gone from 32,000 to well over 40,000. He compares it to a snowball, keeps on growing. And so how can we win? Well, fortunately, winter comes. Where do you put a 40,000-man army in South Jersey? You can't. But you can put 1,000 men here, 1,000 men there. And Washington can't defeat a 40,000-man army, but he can defeat a 1,000-man army. And Mifflin gets him another 4,000 or 5,000 men, and they cross the Delaware. Unfortunately, Mifflin's men don't make it. There's a 3-pincer movement to get across. 2 of them don't make it. Washington makes it, and the rest is history. And he is very successful in that effort here. But here, Thomas Mifflin, a Quaker, is leading in enlisting men for Washington. So a lot of the Quakers don't live by the entire doctrine of Quakers. Sometimes they're excommunicated because they have the slaves and they didn't free their slaves, which they're supposed to do. But sometimes they're not supposed to take part in politics, but they do. And so sometimes they do fight, as in the movie Friendly Persuasion, if you remember that movie, the anguish of the young boy, does he fight or not? So Quakers are in that particular case, it was sort of a witch hunt. There was a letter that was written, maybe it was false, that these Quaker leaders are a danger. We got to get rid of them, and so they seize upon that opportunity. But most of the time, the Quakers are allowed, and conscientious objection is a well recognized and valued protection. Let's break.